The true origin of the Soviet Union's collapse. What historians get wrong. On the night of November 9th, 1989, crowds swarmed the Berlin Wall with hammers and pickaxes. 2 years later, the red flag came down over the Kremlin for the last time. Between those two images sits one of the most repeated stories of the 20th century, that the Soviet Union was destroyed by the fall of the wall, by Ronald Reagan's pressure, or by one reforming leader who lost control of the machine he was trying to fix. That story is not exactly false, but it mistakes the funeral for the cause of death. Because here is the detail that should stop you. Long before Gorbachev came to power, before Glasnost, before a single republic declared independence, the Soviet state had already lost the thing an empire cannot function without. It had lost the ability to pay for itself. The Soviet Union did not collapse because of an idea. It collapsed because it ran out of money, and the specific date on which that became inevitable was not in 1989 or 1991. According to the man who would later run Russia's economy, it was September 13th, 1985, and it happened in Saudi Arabia. This is the story of how the world's second superpower was brought down by an oil price, a grain bill, a military budget nobody could honestly count, and a chain of reforms that broke the machine faster than they fixed it. To understand the fall, you have to understand a substitution that happened quietly in the 1970s. By the late 1960s, the Soviet economy was slowing down. The extraordinary post-war growth rates were fading. Industrial output growth fell from around 8.5% a year in the 1960s to under 6% in the 1970s, and then to under 4% in the early 1980s. The command economy was very good at producing steel, tanks, and cement. It was very bad at producing things people actually wanted, and worse at improving over time. Under normal circumstances, this would have forced a reckoning in the 1970s. It did not. Because in 1973 and again in 1979, the price of oil exploded. And the Soviet Union, which had just opened vast new petroleum fields in western Siberia, suddenly found itself sitting on a river of hard currency. This is the hinge of the entire story, and it is almost always underplayed. The oil boom did not make the Soviet economy healthy. It did the opposite. It made reform unnecessary. Petrodollars papered over every structural failure. And crucially, they paid for two things the system could no longer produce for itself. The first was food. The country that had once been a great grain exporter had become a grain importer, buying roughly a sixth of its grain abroad. Soviet agriculture, collectivized and chronically inefficient, could not feed Soviet cities. Oil money bought American and Canadian wheat. The second was consent. Hard currency bought Western consumer goods, technology, and imported quality that the domestic economy could not deliver. As Peter Avin, later a Russian minister, put it, oil revenue was used to purchase items the USSR could not make and distribute them to the people who mattered. So, by the early 1980s, the Soviet system had become something its founders would not have recognized. A superpower whose internal stability depended on the world price of a single commodity. Now add the second pressure, and this is the one Soviet planners could not escape: the military. Nobody knows the true figure, and that is itself part of the story. Officially, the Soviet defense budget in 1980 was under 3% of GDP, a number so absurd that Western analysts treated it as fiction. The real weapons spending was hidden inside civilian ministries. CIA estimates put defense at somewhere between 14 and 16% of GNP for most of the period. Some independent estimates ran higher, toward 20% by the mid-1980s. Compare that with the United States, spending around 6% of a substantially larger economy. Think about what those numbers mean in practice. 1 in every 6 or 7 rubles of everything the country produced went into a sector that produced nothing consumable. Every missile was a hospital not built, a factory not modernized, a harvest not stored properly. And the burden was growing precisely as growth slowed. Then, in December 1979, Soviet forces entered Afghanistan. The war lasted more than 9 years. It cost around 15,000 Soviet lives, drained resources continuously, and delivered a strategic defeat. But its deepest damage was not military. It was in legitimacy. A state that justified its hardships as necessary sacrifice for a historic mission was sending conscripts home in zinc coffins from a war it could not explain and would not win. There was also a second kind of cost, harder to put on a balance sheet but just as corrosive. The Soviet system ran on a promise: accept the shortages now, because the state is building something historic and it knows what it is doing. Competence was the currency of that promise. In April 1986, that currency was devalued in a single night. Reactor 4 at Chernobyl exploded. The initial response was denial and delay, and Moscow said nothing publicly until Swedish monitoring stations detected the radiation and forced an admission. Citizens in the affected zone were left uninformed for days while May Day parades went ahead in Kiev. The financial cost was enormous, running into many billions of rubles for containment, evacuation, and resettlement, arriving in the worst possible year. But the deeper damage was to the story. Millions of people watched their government conceal a catastrophe that threatened their children, and drew the obvious conclusion about every other reassurance they had ever been given. By the mid-1980s, the picture was this: a slowing economy, a crushing military burden, a food supply dependent on imports, an unwinnable war, and a state whose competence its own citizens had begun to doubt. All of it held together by one thing: the oil price. And on September 13th, 1985, that support was pulled away. On that day, Saudi oil minister Ahmed Zaki Yamani announced that his country would stop cutting production to defend prices. Saudi Arabia would instead fight for market share, and it would open the taps. The effect on world prices was catastrophic for producers. In January 1984, Soviet Urals crude traded around $28.50 a barrel. By the end of January 1986, it was under 20. Within months, prices touched around $12, levels not seen since before the Iranian Revolution, and they stayed depressed below $22 until the summer of 1990. Read that timeline carefully because it is the true chronology of the Soviet collapse. The price broke in 1986. The Union dissolved at the end of 1991. Everything in between is a state trying and failing to survive a revenue shock it had no reserves to absorb. The numbers are brutal. In 1986 alone, the USSR is estimated to have lost more than $20 billion in export earnings. Its external debt, around $30 billion in 1986, reached roughly $50 billion by 1989. Yegor Gaidar, who would later be the architect of Russia's post-Soviet reforms, was blunt about it. The date of the USSR's collapse, he wrote, was not the August coup or the Belovezha Accords. It was September 13, 1985, when Yamani made his announcement. Because remember what oil money was paying for: grain, consumer goods, imported technology. The moment the revenue vanished, the state faced a choice it could not make: stop feeding the cities, stop supplying the elite, or borrow. It borrowed. And borrowing a country out of a structural crisis works only if the structure improves. It did not. Now enters the figure everyone remembers, and here we have to be precise about what he actually did. Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary in March 1985, 6 months before the Saudi announcement. He inherited the stagnation, not the price collapse. His diagnosis was largely correct. The system was sclerotic, dishonest, and falling behind. His remedies, applied in sequence to an economy that was simultaneously losing its main revenue source, made the fiscal crisis dramatically worse. Start with the anti-alcohol campaign of 1985. On public health grounds, the case was strong. Soviet life expectancy had fallen to under 62 years, and roughly half of hospitalizations were linked to alcohol. But alcohol was also a fiscal pillar. The state monopoly on vodka was one of the budget's most reliable revenue streams. When production was slashed, that revenue disappeared. Government income from alcohol fell by around a quarter in 1986, cutting total budget revenue by roughly 3.5%. Meanwhile, illegal home distilling exploded, so the state lost the money while much of the drinking continued. So consider the sequence. In 1985 and 1986, the Soviet government simultaneously lost a huge share of its oil export earnings and a large share of its domestic alcohol revenue, while continuing to fund a military-industrial complex consuming a sixth of national output and a war in Afghanistan. That is not a policy problem. That is a solvency crisis. Then came perestroika, and this is where the deepest damage was done, in a way that is genuinely counterintuitive. The reforms of 1987 and 1988 tried to introduce market elements into a planned economy without dismantling the plan. Enterprises were given more autonomy and allowed to keep profits and set some prices. Cooperatives were legalized. But central planning still governed supply, and prices for most goods remained fixed by the state. The result was the worst of both systems. Enterprises could now raise wages, and they did, dramatically. Money in citizens' hands grew rapidly. But the quantity of goods did not, because production was still allocated by planners, and enterprises had every incentive to shift output toward anything more profitable, away from cheap necessities. Too much money chasing too few goods with prices frozen by law does not produce inflation in the shops. It produces empty shelves. This is the phenomenon that defined the late Soviet experience. Not poverty in the Western sense, but money that could not buy anything. Savings accounts filled up with rubles that had nothing to purchase, an overhang of currency economists called suppressed inflation, waiting to detonate the moment prices were ever freed. The texture of ordinary life became a series of queues. People stood in line without knowing what was being sold, joining first and asking afterward because anything available was worth having. Ration coupons appeared for sugar, soap, and tobacco, in a superpower that had launched the first satellite and put the first human into orbit. In 1990, Moscow, the showcase capital, introduced residency-based rationing to stop shoppers from surrounding regions stripping its shops. Meanwhile, goods did not vanish so much as move. They shifted into the black market and into personal networks, where connections mattered more than money. The official economy emptied while the shadow economy filled, and every transaction in that shadow was a small daily lesson that the state's rules were now optional. And here is the political consequence that matters most. A citizen can accept scarcity if the story explains it. What broke was not just supply, it was the explanation. Glasnost had opened the press, and the same population standing in queues was now reading, openly, about Stalin's terror, about Chernobyl's mishandling, about official privilege and corruption. The two halves of the compact failed together. The state could no longer deliver goods, and it could no longer control the story about why. Now the final pressure, and the one that turned an economic crisis into the end of a country. The Soviet Union was not a nation-state. It was a union of 15 republics, built on a formal fiction of voluntary association that had never been tested because it had always been enforced. Two things dissolved that enforcement. The first was 1989 in Eastern Europe. Gorbachev's decision not to send tanks when Poland, Hungary, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia broke away was, from Moscow's perspective, a rational choice. The empire was unaffordable, but the signal it sent inside the USSR was unmistakable. The threat of force, the ultimate guarantor of the Union, had been withdrawn. The second was economic. As the center's finances collapsed, so did its leverage. A central government that cannot supply goods, pay subsidies, or fund republics has very little left to offer for loyalty. The national movements had deep roots, and they were not identical. In the Baltic republics, the claim was legal as much as ethnic. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had been independent states before their annexation in 1940, and their popular fronts demanded not secession, but restoration of something taken from them. In the Caucasus, the pressure was different and more violent. erupting over Nagorno-Karabakh into open conflict between two Soviet republics that Moscow could neither arbitrate nor suppress. What united them was timing. These movements had existed for decades in suppressed form. They surfaced precisely when the center's capacity to buy loyalty and enforce obedience failed at the same moment. In 1990, Lithuania declared independence outright. Moscow's response was revealing: an economic blockade first, and force only later, in January 1991, when troops in Vilnius killed civilians at the television tower. The crackdown produced international condemnation and Baltic resolve, not submission. But the decisive break was not in the periphery, it was in Russia itself. In June 1990, the Russian Republic declared that its own laws took precedence over Soviet laws. Republics began withholding tax revenue from the central budget, keeping it for themselves. This is what a state actually looks like when it dies. Not the flag coming down, but the tax revenue not arriving. By 1991, Gorbachev was negotiating a new union treaty that would devolve most power to the republics. It was scheduled for signing on August 20th, 1991. On August 19th, hardliners in the party, KGB, and military launched a coup to stop it. They placed Gorbachev under house arrest in Crimea and sent tanks into Moscow. The coup failed in 3 days, and it failed for a reason that reveals everything. The plotters had the hardware and none of the authority. Units would not fire on crowds. Boris Yeltsin, standing on a tank outside the Russian parliament, had something the Soviet leadership no longer possessed anywhere: legitimacy drawn from an actual election. The coup was meant to save the Union. It destroyed it in 72 hours. Every remaining republic concluded that Moscow was both dangerous and weak, the worst possible combination. Independence declarations followed in sequence. In December 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met at Belovezha and declared the Union dissolved. On December 25th, Gorbachev resigned. So return to the popular story. The wall fell and the Soviet Union fell with it. Now look at the sequence we have actually traced. Growth stalls in the 1960s and 1970s. Oil money arrives and postpones reform rather than enabling it. Defense consumes a sixth of national output. Afghanistan drains blood and legitimacy from 1979. The oil price breaks in 1985 and 1986, removing the revenue that fed the cities. Alcohol revenue vanishes at the same moment. Debt doubles. Half reform creates shortages. Glasnost removes the justification. Eastern Europe leaves and the threat of force expires. Republics stop sending taxes. A coup proves the center cannot act. The country dissolves. The Berlin Wall appears in that chain, but late, and as a consequence rather than a cause. This is what most accounts get wrong. They treat the collapse as an ideological event, a contest of systems decided by belief. It was, at ground level, a fiscal event. The Soviet state stopped being able to purchase the things that held it together: food for its cities, goods for its elite, weapons for its status, subsidies for its republics. And there is a pattern here that outlives the Soviet Union. First, resource revenue is not strength. It is an anesthetic. It removes the pain that would otherwise force reform, and it leaves the state hostage to a price it does not set. Every commodity-dependent government since has faced the same trap. Second, military spending is a claim on the future. A sixth of output diverted into weapons is a sixth not compounding into productivity. The burden is invisible while growth is strong and fatal when it stops. Third, partial reform can be more dangerous than none. Loosening wages while freezing prices, decentralizing enterprises while keeping the plan, guarantees shortages. Half a market is not half as good as a market. It can be worse than no market at all. Fourth, a state's real currency is not money, but the belief that it can deliver. When queues lengthen and the press turns honest at the same time, both the delivery and the story fail together. And fifth, empires end at the ledger before they end at the border. The republics did not leave because they suddenly discovered nationalism in 1991. They left because the center had stopped paying. and once it stopped paying, it had nothing left to bargain with. So, when did the Soviet Union actually collapse? Not on December 25th, 1991, when the flag came down. Not in August, when the coup failed. Not in November 1989, when the wall opened. Arguably in September 1985, in a Saudi announcement about production quotas that no one in Moscow could influence. Or earlier still in the 1970s, when a windfall arrived and a country chose to spend it rather than reform with it. The Soviet Union was not defeated in an argument about communism. It ran out of money, and then it ran out of story, and then it ran out of country. That is usually the order.